Good morning again. It is so good to be with you. It is so good to see all of you and to hear the conversations as we share Christ's peace and words of welcome and catching up on life. You can go ahead and have a seat. If you're at home, I hope you're seated already. This morning, we are continuing our sermon series called Feed Your Soul, in which we are looking at the connections between food and faith and community. And I am so delighted to introduce our guest preacher for today. The Reverend Dr Deb Meinke is a retired Presbyterian pastor and the former stated clerk of the Cimarron Presbytery. She and her spouse, Dave, moved to Kansas City late last August to be closer to family. And Deb brings experience not only as a pastor, but also in her first career, she was a paleontologist, an evolutionary biologist, and that helped to show her a love of fossils, rocks, and deep time. She is passionate about people, about community, about climate change, and as we heard this morning, she is also one of the co-chairs of Second's anti-racism group. She is also just one of the most fun and delightful and smartest people I know, and so I am so excited to hear her preach this morning. Let's give her a round of applause to welcome her. All right.
Thank you so much for welcoming me and my spouse to Kansas City. We actually moved here to be close to our son and daughter-in-law and our little toddler grandchild. Our son and daughter-in-law own and operate Heirloom Bakeries. So that's really the star of our family at this point is real food for real people. But thank you very much for welcoming me to the pulpit this morning. So, the story of Ruth. By all accounts, this is one of the happier tales of the Hebrew Bible. You should see before you, I hope, a little photo of Boaz and Ruth, and she's often depicted in images as a plump, rosy-cheeked innocent. But perhaps she might look a little more drawn and gaunt in a more honest portrayal. And we'll find out as I move along that perhaps she's not such an innocent after all either. So stay tuned. Well, the bare bones of Ruth's backstory. Bethlehem, also known as the house of bread, has no bread. And to escape famine in Judah, the Jews, Naomi and Elimelech and their two sons moved to Moab. In other words, to enemy territory. These were desperate times, and people went to great lengths to save their families, as refugees do today. Alas, Elimelech died in Moab. Then Naomi's two adult sons died, leaving Naomi completely without male kin to care for her, as would be the expectation, and at the mercy of her daughters-in-law. So when Naomi heard that the famine at home had ended, she shed her widowhood burdens, left them in Moab, and hit the road. Her daughters-in-law go too. We don't know why, although it seems fairly clear that they must have loved Naomi enough to accompany her. Orpah finally turned back at Naomi's urging, but not Ruth. Ruth stuck with Naomi, as she poetically proclaims, "Till death do us part." And to be honest, Naomi really thought she was just going home to die. So when they arrived, she gave a dramatic speech to those who welcomed them about God abandoning her, so that she was no longer the Naomi who had left, pleasant one, but she returned as Mara, the bitter one. So Ruth's behavior is really sort of inexplicable. Why would she choose Naomi, the foreign widow, her land and her God over her own home and possibly the prospect of marrying again back in Moab. And the end of chapter 1 in Ruth's story really leans into the foolishness and the risk of Ruth's decision. The very last verse says, "So Naomi returned together with Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab." Not a lot of love for the Moabites, remember. But upon their arrival, Ruth, the foreigner from enemy country, starts to do a little reconnaissance, and she made a plan to keep them alive by gleaning. Now, you may be familiar with this practice. Gleaning is one of few ancient anti-poverty programs, considered to be the right of the poor to harvest from the edges of the fields and from the ground, basically picking up leftovers. Although we do have some examples even today with something like After the Harvest here in Kansas City that is sort of a modern incarnation. Anyway, Naomi allowed Ruth to go out and glean barley, and Ruth landed in the fields of Boaz, who, as it turns out, was kin to Naomi's dead husband. Now, Ruth was an excellent, industrious gleaner who caught Boaz's attention. And we learn at this part of the story that Boaz is a righteous man of God, for he permits and encourages gleaning, and he protects the vulnerable young women vulnerable to harassment, perhaps even assault out there in the fields. Now, this includes the foreigner Ruth in that harvest time. So, things were looking up for Ruth, the foreigner, and for her mother-in-law, Naomi, the widow. Well, what follows the harvest? A giant party, of course. Likely a drunken party. So Naomi hatches a plan to reel in Boaz for Ruth. Let's listen to the 3rd chapter of Ruth as we see this plan unfold. So Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to Ruth, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you." Kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. And Ruth said to her, "All that you tell me I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had instructed her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and he was in a contented mood, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then Ruth came stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over. And there, lying at his feet, was a woman. Boaz said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. For all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman. But now, though it is true that I am a near kinsman, there's another more closely related than I. So remain this night, and in the morning, if he will act as next of kin for you, let him do it. But if he is not willing to act as next of kin for you, then as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Lie down until the morning. So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before one person could recognize another. For he said, it must not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And then he said, bring the cloak you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her back, and then he went into the city. She came to her mother-in-law, who said, how did things go with you, my daughter? And she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, he gave me these 6 measures of barley and said, do not go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. And she replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. The word of the Lord. Now, what you may not realize, because this is the Bible, read through our extremely serious lens, is that this part of Ruth's story is full of double entendre. In the Hebrew language, feet is even used as a euphemism for genitals, so the whole episode is scandalous and risky for Ruth. We don't know what really happened, but if you do read on through chapter 4, you will find that the scheme worked to secure Naomi and Ruth's future. Ruth and Boaz are married. Ruth bears an important child, as we will see. So we find through this story of Ruth that God is not only not offended by somewhat disreputable maneuverings by those who have little official power, but God seems to approve of all strategies that favor survival and the flourishing of God's people. Such trickster antics are very common in tales from a wide range of folk and other faith traditions, and they occur here in the Bible as well. Last week, the Presbyterian Women's Bible Study group discovered this trickster in the story of Tamar, who bore her own father-in-law's out-of-wedlock child. You can read all about that scandalous story in the 38th chapter of Genesis. And then, maybe you heard in chapter 3, Ruth is proclaimed by Boaz as a woman of valor. And these aren't just trite words. This is almost a title that he's giving to her. He elevates Ruth to the stature of a worthy woman, kind of like the woman in the last chapter of Proverbs who is praised and lauded as a woman of valor for her industry and care for her family. So Boaz gives her this title for sticking with Naomi in dark times and for deploying her cleverness in pursuit of security for both of them. So we women might feel an affinity with Ruth or possibly Naomi as vulnerable widows, perhaps remembering those who have been treading shaky economic grounds throughout this pandemic. or gaining some new empathy for the plight of the poor, the frontline workers, many of whom are immigrants, who sustained us with food and with goods, in fact, who still do, although in many ways they seem invisible to us. So Ruth's story tells us loud and clear, God loves foreigners and women, especially resourceful ones who might have bent the rules just a bit. So those of us who are reading the story through a lens of privilege, we might ask ourselves the question of how well do we align with the wealthy and powerful Boaz, who protected Ruth and took her into his family and restored Naomi to a place of dignity in their community. Well, recent events at our southern border, if you see on screen, indicate that as a country we're not emulating Boaz too well. We have some work to do in taking a stand against a strengthening tide of nationalism. For we are called to reach out as Boaz did, since it is clear that God has a preferential option for the stranger, for the alien, and for the poor. In contrast to the Border Patrol activities, I heard a broadcast this week on KCUR about the story of a young Afghan woman named Zamzama Safi, aspiring to be educated and free. She was kidnapped, raped, and tortured by the Taliban, but managed to escape and recently arrived in the US to start a new life, as we see her with some of her rescuers. Zamzama surely is a woman of valor, of endurance, of strength. Well, suffice it to say that we as a nation are clearly full of contradictions in our official refugee and asylum policies, but as Christians lifting the banner of Matthew 25, our action plan is clear. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am thankful that many here at Second Pres are seeing beyond fear-based nationalism, as you have with past waves of refugees coming into this nation. And I'm glad that we're looking forward to, and we need to stay tuned to hear about possible opportunities in the coming weeks where we can welcome and support an Afghan refugee family through this congregation and others. But Ruth's story is more complex than welcome. It's far deeper than us extending charity to people in need. One of the most striking aspects of Ruth's story as I reread it to prepare for today is the give and take, the mutuality of the interactions of Ruth and Naomi, and even Boaz. When we understand God as being on the side of the poor and oppressed, we learn that victims of terrible tragedies are more than victims. They are human beings, they are agents, even in their own lives. They are living proof of the endurance of hope and creativity in using scarce resources and in the strength of communities that are indeed better together. So what might our new neighbors teach us? What might we learn about the crises that we are living in, sustainability and climate change? As just one example, you might see up on screen, I can't see it from here. Oh, there we go. You might know, or maybe not, that many non-European cultures have tasty and resourceful ways of preparing insects. Being high protein and lower fat, we squeamish eaters have been rather slow to adopt this trend, but we might do well to indeed take on a less meat-intensive diet, because that may indeed be one of the ways that we as individuals and families can actually be part of the solution in the era of accelerating climate change that we are experiencing even now. On a somewhat lighter note, if you're an armchair traveler, I would highly recommend the public TV show No Passport Required, hosted by Chef Marcus Samuelsson, who guides us through the immigrant food community scene in a lot of American cities. And I'd like to take a minute to just watch the preview of the season 2 of this series.
I'm Chef Marcus Samuelsson, and as an immigrant born in Ethiopia and raised in Sweden, food to me has always told a deeper, more personal story. It's a path to culture, identity, and history. Join me on a new journey across the country to see how food connects us all.
No passport required, only on PBS.
What a joyous and uplifting journey that can be, that illustrates both the wisdom and the delight that we can have in being fed by foreigners. And of course, we have access to those same opportunities right here in Kansas City. So that's food, very basic, right? The most basic thing. But how does Ruth's story feed our souls? Because Ruth's story is about food, but it's not only about food. Ruth and Naomi, from different ethnic and religious traditions, from different generations, work together to survive and prosper. I was struck by Katie's remark about her in-laws. That just fits so well today, that this relationship between Ruth and Naomi as daughter-in-law and mother-in-law, which is often sort of fraught, or it can also be a source of deep, deep love and delight. Sometimes Ruth took the lead, and sometimes Naomi. It was a beneficial relationship to both of them. And then Boaz was pulled right along too. What a contrast to our European ancestors having stolen land and livelihood without just compensation or even acknowledgement of our dependence on the native inhabitants who shared their knowledge freely with us or with our ancestors. So with this example of Ruth and Naomi before us, I suggest that following the lead of our Kansas City Indian Center partners, we're trying to establish that relationship in our anti-racism activities. Their work to restore sustainable practices like foraging might be one way of making amends and helping to acknowledge our own indebtedness to the native populations displaced by our ancestors. And on the near-term time scale, look for a Be the Church opportunity right here to plant some native plant species in honor and recognition of that legacy of interdependence that we share with our indigenous neighbors. You see, friends, there are so many paths for us to walk with and to honor our neighbors, near and far, in addressing the problems of food insecurity and climate change and so many other things. And in doing so, we will know that we are walking with God. Now, as Christians, we actually hold up Ruth as one of our important Jewish foremothers. And she appears in Matthew's genealogy as one of 4 women with somewhat checkered pasts. So listen for their names as Kristen reads us the first portion of Matthew's genealogy of Jesus.
A record of the ancestors of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Aram. Aram was the father of Aminab. There we go. Aminab was the father of Nahshon. Nahshon was the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David the king. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been the wife of Uriah.
Thank you, Kristen. So you heard Tamar. Once again, she is the widow of one of Judah's sons who masquerades as a prostitute to ensure Jacob's lineage is carried on. You heard the name Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute who saved Israelite spies, scouting out Jericho on behalf of Joshua. You heard an allusion to Bathsheba, raped by King David, who murdered her husband Uriah, but who becomes the father or the mother of Solomon. And Ruth, the foreign widow who risked her future by sticking with her mother-in-law, adopting a new home, a new God, and securing their place by her labors. So we hear in this lineage prostitutes, women, foreigners, whom we might otherwise dismiss, because isn't the rule 3 strikes and you're out? These women were hardly destined for a heroic defense of Israel, yet they are key partners in fulfilling the promises made by God to Abraham, the ones that say, I will make of you a great nation. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed, and your descendants shall be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Ruth heard these promises and adopted them as her own. So as you sign up over these coming weeks to take part in Be the Church activities and reflect on how you will enact your intention to be better together, I ask you to remember how God feeds our souls and our bodies through foreigners. Know that you are surrounded by neighbors near and far who lead us in restoring our earthly home, the garden that God placed the very first humans into. And so, my friends, followers of Jesus, live like these women of valor, like these grandmothers in the faith, the ones who dared to stake their claim to the abundant promises of God. Amen.